Hello and welcome. I'm Olivia Mattis, and I'm so delighted that you're joining us today on behalf of the Sousa Mendez Foundation. I represent a foundation that honors a hero, a rescuer of World War II, Aristides de Sousa Mendez, who risked everything to save strangers, people he didn't even know, and he lost everything. We embody with our foundation the values that Sousa Mendez put forward, foremost among them being moral courage. We look to profile stories of moral courage, and today we're bringing you the epitome of a story of moral courage, and that is the story of Fred Korematsu. We're showing the Emmy Award-winning film of civil wrongs and rights, the Fred Korematsu story. We are very blessed to have the filmmaker himself, Eric Paul Fournier, with us. He's the first speaker that you'll hear today. This film has won all kinds of awards and it's being reissued. We are very fortunate to be able to bring it to you because it's not possible to view nowadays. So I'm very grateful to the filmmaker for making it available to you through us. We also have one of the heroes of the story. Her name is Lori Banai, and she was part of the team of lawyers that represented Fred Korematsu in his successful case in the 1980s after he had been defeated in that terrible Supreme Court decision from 1944. So it's thanks to Lori's effort that and that of her colleagues that justice was achieved, not only for Fred Korematsu, but for others who had been similarly situated, who had been wrongly imprisoned, incarcerated during the war period. And Lori's here to tell you about that history and her own experience working on the case, working with Fred Korematsu as her client. And RAFAEL Medофф, Dr. Medофф, whom you know from many of our programs, is a renowned historian, expert, especially on the American response or non-response, say, to the Holocaust. And he's here to draw parallels between how Roosevelt saw Jewish refugees and how he saw Asian Americans. So he's here to draw those parallels for you. As usual, you will be muted, so I hope you will have lots of questions. So please do type those questions into the chat box, and we will get to all of your questions, or as many as we can, later in the hour. So let's start with Eric. Eric, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for watching the film. I'm Eric Fournier. I made the film that hopefully you just saw or are about to see. I've been asked to talk for about 10 minutes. I usually let my films speak for themselves. But in this case, I haven't watched of Civil Wrongs and Rights all the way through in quite a while. I just watched it again for the first time in a few years. And in preparation for this talk, initially, my plan was just to talk about why I came to make the film. But after watching it, I find myself very dismayed about how much of the film's message is still resonating today. How much of what is going on today with the current administration's policies, the racial animus, the stereotyping, the use of the Enemy Aliens Act, the lack of due process, these things are all playing out once again. I made this documentary almost 25 years ago now. And the film was made as a cautionary tale then, but also to celebrate the righting of a great wrong. So while it's nice to have something that I made long ago still be so relevant, it's also very disheartening. As it should be for anyone who cares about justice, equality, the rule of law. To see this play out again in our country so vividly is kind of frightening to me. But on that topic and the ongoing importance of the case, I will leave that to my esteemed friend and an eminent scholar, Lori Banai, who can do a much better job than I can in that regard. That said, I'm going to say a little bit about how I came to make the film and why at the time I thought it was an important film to make. A little bit about my background to understand my passion for the topic and why I made the film. Obviously, I'm not Japanese American. This was not my story or my family's story. In fact, it was somewhat controversial in the beginning to have a non-Asian person helming Fred's documentary. First, I was friends with the family. I was and still am a very dear friend of Ken Korematsu, Fred's son. Sometime back in the 90s, Ken's mom, Catherine, came to Ken and asked him to make a documentary about his dad. After a couple of fits and starts, Ken came to me and asked me to help. And I jumped at the chance. But even with the fact that I had the family support, there were some people that didn't want a non-Asian person telling the story. And I get it. Historically, there have been far too many abuses of histories left to be told in the wrong hands. So I reached out to a number of people, both in order to pitch my approach and to gain understanding, as well as their support. The fact that Fred's story, to me, was a deeply all-American tale, and that the Supreme Court case that bore his name was one of the top 3 most egregious decisions ever made by the court, along with Plessy versus Ferguson and the Dred Scott decisions. That idea that Justice Jackson said in his dissenting opinion at the time, that the court's ruling, and I paraphrase here, is that the principle of racial discrimination and the transplanting of American citizens lies about like a loaded weapon to be used by any authority that can bring forward a plausible claim. This principle should be important to all Americans. Again, Lori can address this better. And I think that's what the Quorum Nobis legal teams were trying to educate us about, as well as winning the justice that had been long delayed for their clients. I had grown up knowing about the camps. My father was a political science professor and a teacher of government. When I was a very young man, maybe 12 or 13, he took me to see a movie called Bad Day at Black Rock, starring Spencer Tracy. It dealt with wartime racism, the hatred towards Japanese Americans, the 442, and the internment camps, all wrapped up in a murder mystery. I highly recommend watching it. Obviously, my father had to tell me a little bit and give me a primer on what had happened during World War II in order to help me understand the film better. Because on the East Coast, where I was brought up, most of the racial politics and strife were between whites and African Americans. It wasn't until I moved to San Francisco for college that I became aware of the anti-Asian sentiment that had pervaded the West Coast politics for more than a century. As you saw, my film was about Fred and his decision not to comply with the relocation order. As briefly mentioned in the film, there were other challengers, most notably Gordon Hirabayashi and Min Yasui. Some 40 years later, these 3 cases were all litigated again in coordination with each other. These became known as the Quorum Nobis cases. Fred's case was the only one of these 3, however, that directly addressed the legality of the camps and the incarceration. Of these 3 men, Fred was arguably also the most controversial. Both Gordon and Min set out to challenge the orders. They set out to get arrested, to go to court. Min was a lawyer, Gordon was a young university student, but Fred was just your ordinary guy. He was a welder. He had a Caucasian girlfriend. He just wanted to stay with her. He was brought up thinking of himself as an American. He didn't speak Japanese. He thought, and rightfully so, that he had the same rights that all Americans have. He knew in his bones that this order was wrong, and he decided not to comply. That the fact that it wasn't quote unquote a principled stand made some people feel that he was unworthy of the title hero. Even after he fought to reopen his case and won, even after he was awarded the Medal of Freedom. I feel much like Peter Ryan said in the film, that that is just what makes Fred so heroic. He was the ordinary guy. He knew it was wrong and he stood up, not just once, but twice. Once as a young 20-something man, when it's much easier to be bold, when you have your whole life ahead of you. You may not see the full consequences of your actions, and I think this is not acknowledged enough. But that bravery to stand up a second time, decades later, after he had rebuilt his life, gotten married, had children, and a good job as a technical draftsman, he had built himself a solid middle-class life. He had been vilified before because after losing his case in 1944, he was seen as having given the government justification and validation to do what they did. To consider all of this and risk it all again, that takes a special kind of courage. I think that the most important part of Fred's story is that the importance for all of us to speak up when we see injustice, no matter the cost. Even if you lose at first, keep trying. Don't be afraid. Speak up. I think that's probably about my time. So I will pass it on to Lori.
Thank you so much, Eric. I also recently watched the film again after many years of not watching it, and it's such a gift, Eric, that you recorded Fred's story, because again, we still have so much to learn from it. I'm going to say a few words about working on Fred's case, as well as my own thoughts on how his case has continued frightening relevance. You saw in the film a few of my colleagues talking about the case. These are you saw some of these individuals on the film. These are the five of us are at this press conference, but there were many, many more people who actually worked on the case. My colleagues on the legal team were extraordinary, and they worked endless hours on the cases. We were joined by dozens of other lawyers, as well as law students, other volunteers who wrote research memos, helped review thousands of documents, and raise money to support the bare bones operations of the teams. For those of you who are lawyers or retired lawyers who are in the crowd, this was way before like great word processing and Westlaw and Lexis and all of this electronic stuff. So it was very manual labor. Many members of the team were Japanese American, like me, whose families had been incarcerated. The teams were driven by a strong sense of not only trying to right an egregious wrong, but also to using these cases to help educate the public so that hopefully nothing similar would happen again. Of course, we had to do the legal work in order to win, but we also knew that a legal win would do little to prevent something similar if a public driven by ignorance, prejudice, and fear targets another vulnerable community. If people knew what happened to Japanese Americans, maybe they would prevent history from repeating itself. Sadly, as a law professor, I would tell my students, on some level, laws and statutes are just pieces of paper. If you've got a public who really wants to target a vulnerable group, as this organization truly knows. We held press conferences and spoke about the cases and the continued relevance of the Japanese American incarceration. We were covered by national media, all the major papers, the networks, and even 60 Minutes. Ed Bradley from 60 Minutes came out and had a segment on our case. We spoke about the cases before civic and church groups, colleges, universities, other organizations like yours, and we continue to do so today. Fred, as you could imagine, was an incredible client. He knew the case was about more than just him. He trusted us and relied on our advice after getting over some initial trepidation about how young we were. I was involved in this case 2 years out of law school, so I truly sympathize with his initial concern. He was a wonderful man, and Eric certainly knows what I mean. He was somewhat kind of reticent. He wasn't really outgoing. He was soft-spoken. And he was initially really reluctant to speak. In fact, he asked us to make sure that there wasn't press camped outside on his front yard, and we promised him there wouldn't be. But then when he saw how hard we were working, he started to go out and speak about his case to help raise money for our expenses. But then after he began to speak across the country, he became somewhat of a symbol for others fighting injustice. And so, sad to say, when 60 Minutes came, they were camped outside on his front yard. But that was fine with him then. It was so great to see this change in him and this courage in him, but even more so to see him embraced by the Japanese American community that had rejected him during World War II. Fred's case, of course, has continued to have haunting relevance. Eric's already talked about this some. The loaded weapon. Daily, we see arrests, detentions, instances of bending, breaking the rule of law. I want to just discuss 3 points in this regard. First, the incarceration teaches us much about the danger of the toxic mix of ignorance and fear, how deep-seated prejudices that harm communities of color, immigrant communities, and other historically marginalized groups exist and become public policy. How, time and again, the rights and human dignity of vulnerable communities have been sacrificed when the majority feels or is persuaded to feel that people who are different from them are a threat to their personal or economic well-being. Second, the wartime incarceration and cases say much about the importance of upholding the rule of law, especially during times of perceived crisis, when people are most likely to be led to compromise rights and fundamental values, thinking it will keep them safer. In this regard, not only do we need to elect people, of course, who we believe are principled and will uphold the rule of law, but also our courts need to fulfill their constitutional role to act as a check on their coordinate branches of government. On this issue, the specter of Korematsu still looms, and it's looming really largely right now in this country. During World War II, the Supreme Court upheld the mass removal of Japanese Americans, saying it had to defer to the government when it claims its actions are based on national security. In Hirabayashi, it stated, whereas the Supreme Court said, whereas they did here, the conditions call for the exercise of judgment and discretion by the war-making branches of government, it is not for any court to sit in review of the wisdom of their action or substitute its judgment for theirs. This deference seems to allow the government simply to say the words national security to get the court to back down from its constitutional role of acting as a check on the other branches of government. And of course, we're seeing this here today, where the executive is saying, I'm doing this because of national security, and there's no inquiry into, well, what is the national security involved here? Fast forward to President Trump's travel ban, which barred travel from specifically mostly Muslim majority countries. Numerous court challenges were filed. The government again argued that the courts needed to defer to the president on issues of national security. As the cases moved up through the courts, Fred's case was not far from people's minds. At oral argument in the Hawaii case in 2017, Ninth Circuit Judge Richard Paez raised the Korematsu case in questioning Acting Solicitor General Jeffrey Wall. He asked, wouldn't the leeway the Justice Department sought from the court also have justified the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II? Wall said, this case is not Korematsu, and I wouldn't be standing here, and the United States wouldn't be defending it if it were. You're not anywhere near Korematsu. In 2018, the Supreme Court issued its opinion in Trump versus Hawaii. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the majority, quoted a list of anti-Muslim statements made by candidate and President Trump, like Islam hates us. But he still upheld the travel ban on behalf of the court. And he did so by deferring to the government's claims that its actions were required by national security. He said, "We cannot substitute our assessment for the executive's predictive judgments on national security matters, all of which are delicate, complex, and involve large elements of prophecy." Justice Sotomayor, in dissent, stated numerous ways in which the travel ban was similar to Korematsu. Again, the court was upholding a group-based suspicion, saying that a group, because of their religious affiliations, were suspected of espionage and sabotage. And like the court did in Korematsu, she said, the court here deferred to the government, where the government claimed it was acting in national security. In response to Justice Sotomayor, Justice Roberts said, "Korematsu has nothing to do with this case. The forcible relocation of US citizens to concentration camps solely and explicitly on the basis of race is objectively unlawful and outside the scope of presidential authority." While explaining how the travel ban was different from Korematsu, he still took the opportunity to repudiate Korematsu. Korematsu was gravely wrong the day it was decided and has been overruled in the court of history, and to be clear, has no place in the law under the Constitution. What does it mean that Korematsu has been overruled in the court of history? None of us actually really know. As far as I know, there's no such thing as a court of history, so it hasn't actually been overruled. But whatever the court meant, its purported disavowal of Korematsu is hollow, when in the same breath it affirmed a travel ban that had its roots in branding a whole people, Muslims, as potential terrorists based on dangerous religious stereotypes, and it affirmed the most dangerous aspects of Korematsu, that is, the court should defer to the president on issues of national security. So instead of actually bearing Korematsu, Trump versus Hawaii rejuvenated Korematsu into our present law. Lastly, the incarceration reminds us of the critical importance of education, allyship, and vigilance. Education, of course, we felt strongly, as I mentioned, about education as a means to make sure that things like this don't happen again. It's frightening to see the ways in which this country today, from Oval Office to local school boards, is seeking to sanitize history and prohibiting teaching and learning that encompasses the value and values diverse peoples and views and the mistakes made in the past so that we can learn from them. Allyship is, of course, critically important as well, especially when small, powerless communities come under attack. During World War II, very few spoke out against the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans stood virtually alone. None of the major civil rights organizations at the time opposed it when it occurred, and a silent majority let it happen. Finally, and relatedly, society must be vigilant. In her closing of her opinion, Judge Patel reflected on the importance of vigilance against injustice. She said, "Korematsu stands as a constant caution that in times of distress, the shield of national security must not be used to protect governmental actions from close scrutiny. It stands as a caution that in times of international hostility, our institutions, legislative, executive, and judicial, must be prepared to exercise their authority to protect all citizens from the petty fears and prejudices that are so easily aroused." While she speaks about the need for vigilance on the part of the branches of government, her words apply equally to each of us and our responsibility to speak up to protect others. Raphael, let me pass it to you.
Thank you very much, Lori. My own area of research focuses on how President Franklin D. Roosevelt and his administration responded to Nazism and the Holocaust. In my remarks today, I want to share with you some thoughts on a surprising and very interesting connection between FDR's policy toward Jewish refugees trying to flee from the Holocaust and his policy toward Japanese Americans. At the heart of the question of America's response to the Holocaust is a kind of a mystery. The mystery is why FDR went above and beyond the existing laws in order to suppress Jewish refugee immigration into the United States. As we know, there was a strict quota system in place in those days regulating immigration. And yet, in almost every year that Roosevelt was president, the quotas for immigrants from Germany were never filled. In fact, most of those years, they were only 25% filled, meaning that the president and his administration went far beyond what the existing law required in order to keep Jewish refugees from coming to America. For many years, as I worked on this subject, I had not imagined there would be any connection between Roosevelt's policy, his attitudes towards Jewish refugees, and his mass detention of 130,000 Japanese Americans without any cause. And then some years ago, a historian named Greg Robinson, based in Canada, wrote a fascinating book called By Order of the President, in which he explored a central mystery involving the mass internment of the Japanese Americans. The mystery he confronted was, how was it that a liberal Democrat, self-described humanitarian president could make such a racist and reactionary decision, so fundamentally contrary to liberal values and humanitarian ideals, to round up 130,000 people and ship them off to detention camps around the country. Professor Robinson found the answer by looking at a number of articles that President Roosevelt wrote in the 1920s and 1930s, before he was president. Now, these were not articles that he wrote when he was, a hot-headed teenager. These were essays in major magazines and a weekly newspaper column that Roosevelt wrote in the 1920s, when he was already a mature adult and already a national politician. The writings we're going to be looking at momentarily begin in 1920, when President Roosevelt, when Franklin Roosevelt was running as the Democratic nominee for vice president. So he was campaigning for the vice presidency. He was interviewed by a newspaper in Brooklyn and asked about matters involving immigration. What surprised me when I looked at these remarks in the Brooklyn Eagle interview and in other writings by FDR about immigration and race, and especially about Asian Americans, was how similar they were to what I had discovered and other historians had uncovered regarding FDR's remarks about Jews and Jewish immigrants. In many cases, I found the language that FDR used when referring to Jews was almost identical to what he said during that same period and all the way into the 1940s regarding Japanese Americans. In the first quote that we're looking at here, on the left, we see Roosevelt complaining in 1920 about foreign elements crowding into our cities. This is a reference to Jews, not only Jews, of course, but there was a very large Jewish immigrant population, of course, in New York City and other major cities. And his complaint was that they do not easily conform to the manners and the customs and the requirements of the rest of American society. And on the right, you see an article that Roosevelt wrote when he was a columnist for a Georgia newspaper, the Macon Daily Telegraph, just a few years after the quote on the left. And here on the right, he's talking about Japanese immigrants to the United States. And he's saying essentially the same thing. They're not capable of assimilating into the American population. He saw something about Jews and about Asians, something in them that made it impossible in his mind for them to become fully American. When we look at the second quotation, the second comparison of quotations, we see that for Roosevelt, the matter of blood was a prominent part of his thinking on these issues. On the left, we have a private conversation that then President Roosevelt had with a close political ally, U.S. Senator Burton Wheeler of Montana. Just as an aside, I want to mention here that in Roosevelt's comments about Jews, they were not comments he made in the public arena. They're private statements he made, and we have them because He made them in conversations with political allies who happened to note them in their diaries. It was a common hobby in those days for even prominent political leaders to keep personal diaries just for their own information, never intending them to become public. And in some cases, historians have found instances in which Roosevelt confided to a friend or colleague something he would not have said in public because he knew that it would be very disturbing and unacceptable to say such things in public. But here he is in 1939 on the left-hand side of your screen, talking about how glad he is that there's no Jewish blood in his veins and in Senator Wheeler's veins. On the right, we see another column from Roosevelt's writings for the Macon Daily Telegraph, where he talks about how European blood of the right sort, as he considered it, would be good for America. He did not want that Asian, what he called Asian or Japanese blood. Often he referred to it as Oriental blood. But European blood of the right sort, that he would consider acceptable. In the next comparison, we find Roosevelt focusing on the idea that both Jews and Asians were, in a sense, poisonous, his word, to the United States. On the left, we have him talking again about European immigration, foreigners crowding up the country. Again, not only Jews, but these and many other references refer to Jews to a significant extent. Here he's reflecting in 1925 on the great waves of immigration in recent years, which included, as we know, several million European Jews. And he saw them as, in his words, almost poisonous to American society because they didn't assimilate. They didn't shed their old sentiments, religious practices, national feelings. And so he saw it as something that was really a danger to the makeup of American society. On the right-hand side, we have an article that FDR wrote in Asia magazine in 1923. Again, the reference is to blood. Here he was talking about the danger of mingling white with Oriental blood. And the problem he saw was that these people are non-assimilable, just as the Jews were not assimilable. Here too, what he called Orientals were not assimilable. They would stand out. They would be different from the rest of American society, and therefore he considered that unacceptable. In the next quotations that I want to share with you, we have a striking similarity of both language and concept. On the left, we have first a quote from 1943. It's the middle of World War II. President Roosevelt was having lunch at the White House with Prime Minister Winston Churchill. We know the contents of the conversation because the Vice President, Henry Wallace, was on hand, and he jotted them down in his diary. He said President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill were talking about what they called the best way to settle the Jewish question after the war. What are we going to do with the Jews? And Roosevelt said that he thought that the Jews should be spread thin. We should spread the Jews thin all over the world, which, as I note in the quote below it, is similar to something he had said 20 years earlier. So we're looking here at a remarkable consistency of attitude of racism on the part of Franklin Roosevelt. In the lower quote, you see that he talked about how the greater part of the foreign population of the city of New York, obviously meaning largely Jews, should be distributed to different localities upstate. He saw populations that he did not particularly like, almost as like chess pieces, that they could just be moved around. You could take these people and spread them around the world, or you can distribute them upstate, get them out of the way so we wouldn't have to look at them so much. Here on the right, we have a press conference that FDR gave in 1944. This is perhaps the most striking of the similarities between what President Roosevelt said about Japanese Americans and what he said about Jewish immigrants. This idea of spreading and scattering people around. I just want to emphasize here that the remark about spreading the Jews thin was in 1943. And the quotes we're about to look at regarding spreading the Japanese Americans around was in 1944, just a year later. He was asked at a press conference, what will happen to all these Japanese Americans who you've put in detention camps when the war ends? Where are they going to go? Do you have any plan? And Roosevelt talked about the need for scattering them through the country. And he referred specifically to the Hudson River Valley or Western Georgia, which, by the way, is an interesting geographical reference, because in the quote about spreading the Jews thin around the world, he also, not coincidentally, I don't think, he also talked about how the Jews have been spread around. The Hudson River Valley was where, of course, Roosevelt grew up and where his home was located in Hyde Park, New York. That's what he's referring to there. There are only a sprinkling of Jews in that area. And in Western Georgia, that's where he spent years recovering from polio. Same thing. He knew there were only a couple of Jews in that area. And so he's thinking about the Japanese in the exact same way during this press conference. Scatter them around. Just like in the Hudson River Valley or in Western Georgia, a half a dozen or a dozen families could be scattered around on the farms. And that way you can work them into the community. They wouldn't discombobulate the existing population very much. Scattering them all around the United States, not going to upset anybody. Franklin Roosevelt had a vision of America, which was of a society that would be predominantly white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. Jews and Asian Americans did not fit comfortably in that picture. There were a significant number of Jews in New York State, where he lived, where he was the governor. There were, of course, 130,000 Japanese Americans that he at that very moment had confined, condemned to languishing in awful conditions in detention camps around the country. These were not people he really wanted in America. He wanted to keep them out of the way. He saw both Jews and Japanese Americans as having something in their blood that made it impossible for them to fully assimilate, to be fully trustworthy, to be fully American in his mind. There are other private remarks that FDR made during that same period where he talked about how there were too many Jews, for example, at Harvard University. He'd been on the board of governors at Harvard and had helped implement the quota to limit the admission of Jews, because he said if too many Jews were admitted into Harvard, they would gradually take over the culture of the university. There are other remarks he made in private alleging that Jews were dominating the economy in Poland or the culture in Germany. He had this idea. Now, many of the ideas were common, but that doesn't make them any more acceptable, any less disturbing. But he saw, it seems to me, looking at the things he was saying and writing about Japanese Americans and the strong similarity to the things he was saying privately about Jews in those days, that he saw Jews and he saw Asian Americans essentially through the same lens. He saw them as troublesome, as untrustworthy, as potentially dangerous, poisonous in his words. And that, unfortunately, is a reality about a president whom we appropriately revere for leading America out of the Depression and to the brink of victory in World War II, and yet who also harbored very troubling and racist attitudes toward both of those minority groups.
Okay, wow. You've all three given us so much to think about. There are lots of questions in that chat box, and audience members, please continue to put those questions in. We will get to as many as we can. So right now it's my time to tell you a little bit about what we have upcoming here at the Susan Mendez Foundation, and then we will get to your questions. So next Sunday is Mother's Day. So happy early Mother's Day. We're doing a Mother's Day themed program. We're showing a film called Family Treasures Lost and Found, and it's the quest of a journalist named Karen Frankel to find out who her mother really was, her mother who had been through the Holocaust but had left so much unsaid. So Karen went on a quest to discover all of the truth about her mother and discovered a woman of incredible courage and resilience. So it's a very touching, very personal program, and I do hope you will join us next week. In a little bit, we're going to see the trailer for that film. Right now, I also want to tell you what we have upcoming in June. So we have 2 free programs right at the beginning of June. Registration is open for the first of those programs. On June 1st, we're showing a film about our hero, Sousa Mendes. It's a feature film that was made in Portugal called The Consul of Bordeaux. We have the filmmaker who's going to be joining us. We also have someone who's in our audience today, Elizabeth Eames, whose family was saved by Sousa Mendes. She'll be telling her own family history, and we'll have one of Sousa Mendes's great-grandchildren here to tell you the story from the family's point of view. So that's what's coming up in early June. But right now, we're going to show you a little trailer for what we have upcoming next week.
This is my family. They lived in Poland and Germany and had fulfilling and productive lives until the Nazi onslaught. This is my great-grandmother, Sarah Levy-Finkelstein. She too was in a plastic garbage bag all rolled up for almost 30 years. So this is the family archive. These albums contain hundreds of photographs that reflect assimilated Jewish life in Poland on my mother's side of the family.
I was not aware of the fact that I was Jewish until I went to school, and for the first time somebody called me a dirty Jew.
And this is the last picture of my mother with her mother in Krakow.
I think that somewhere along the line I made a decision that the best way to die was to walk out of the ghetto, because they would shoot you on the spot. And I left within 5 minutes. And I was wondering if these people were absolutely out of their minds to hide me. All of them would have been shot.
My father couldn't bear to talk about the past. So I started searching for the house where my father grew up in Lvov, now Lviv, Ukraine. And I knew nothing about my father's time in Vienna as a medical student. My father arrived when the violence on campus was extreme.
Mom, who was Rose Frankel?
And my mother said, "Oh, well, you know, your father was married before he met me." What? I put in Rose Frankel. And there's Rose arguing with a Cuban immigration official, saying, "Why can't he come?" And the immigration officer says, "He can't because he's a Jew." And she says, "Yes, that was his first crime. He was born a Jew." No Jews were allowed to disembark, including my father. I needed to find out things for myself to understand him better.
Okay, so now we'll get to audience questions, and there are quite a few. So someone's asking about Justice Robert Jackson and his role in both the Korematsu trial and the Nuremberg trials. So first of all, what was his role in the Nuremberg trials, and was his role in those 2 trials inconsistent?
Well, Justice Jackson, I don't think they were inconsistent, with the exception of the fact that FDR asked Robert Jackson to be the chief prosecutor at the Nuremberg trials. And I think he did, an obviously excellent job there. He was obviously on the right side in Korematsu. He had been named to the court by Roosevelt, and he was a friend of Roosevelt's, yet he was one of the few that kind of stood up against what Roosevelt, the executive order. So I don't see them as inconsistent at all.
Someone in our audience lives in the UK and says that the UK interned Italians during World War II. Can somebody talk about that internment and how it was similar or different?
Ori?
I don't know anything about that internment, but I will say in the United States, certainly there was some German and Italian immigrants were picked up during World War II, and some were interned, but they had been given individual hearings. And so that was a difference here. So I'm sorry, I can't speak to that.
Yeah, I'd
Well,
like to, I'd like to,
They were foreign nationals largely. They weren't
right.
American citizens.
Go ahead, Raphael.
I would add that the important distinction was this: small numbers of Italian Americans or German Americans were detained on suspicion that they might be disloyal. There was no mass roundup of all Italian Americans or German Americans, even though America was at war with those countries. Whereas in the case of the Japanese Americans, you had all Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were sent off to these camps on the basis strictly of the fact that they had a particular racial or ethnic background. So it was a decision based on race as opposed to being based on actual national security concerns.
And this is actually what the whole deal about right now with the Alien Enemies Act is, right? Is that President Trump is seeking to use the authority to pick up citizens of a foreign country. So immigrants, not citizens. And that's how they initially picked up Japanese Americans Japanese right after Pearl Harbor. Some of the immigrant parents were picked up under the Alien Enemies Act. There was no legal basis at all for picking up all of the Japanese Americans. 2/3 of those put into camp were American citizens. So you're seeing a lot going on right now where President Trump is saying, well, members of this Venezuelan gang, it's attacking our country. So I'm going to use the Alien Enemies Act. And a judge just said, no, that's not at all what the act's about. So I mentioned to you how the lower courts during the World War II or during recent years have really fought back against exercise of executive power, and we're seeing that today. Many of the lower courts are really pushing back on the president's ability to say, I have this broad authority.
I would just add that the difference, of course, in the two situations is that the Japanese Americans were not members of violent gangs, and they weren't criminals. They weren't illegal aliens. They had entered the United States legally, and as Lori, you just noted, most of them were American citizens. But
without due process, we don't know that the people that are being rounded up now are actually gang members, right?
Well, right. I would just say, fortunately, the due process that is being used now includes appeals to various judges. Lori just mentioned a number of lower court judges have interfered with some of the specific deportations or blocked them for various reasons. So there is, fortunately, a legal process today, which unfortunately Japanese Americans did not enjoy back in the 1940s.
But I have to say, there have been deportations without due process. There have been deportations without hearings. And so that's what they're all fighting about right now, is that the Trump administration wants to just put people on planes without any determination about whether they're a gang member, whether or not, what they've done. And so now the lower courts are pushing back and say they at least are required to have a hearing.
Question about Roosevelt. Did he buy into the theory of eugenics that was popular at that time?
Yes, he certainly did. The idea that there were different races with distinctive flaws was, of course, very widespread in those days, and Roosevelt, unfortunately, shared those general conceptions. He certainly saw Asians and as well as Jews as being fundamentally different in their blood. He kept using that phrase "blood," and that's very much a eugenicist term.
One of our audience members says or conjectures that FDR's humanitarian label might really be due to Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet member as Secretary of Labor. Is that correct?
No, I would ascribe it to a different source. In the 1930s, FDR and his political aides actively cultivated the image of him as a humanitarian. You may recall that they coined the phrase "the champion of the forgotten man." That was a reference to the idea that FDR would lead America out of the Depression, and that he had a genuine heartfelt concern for what people were suffering as a result of the Great Depression. So based on that, they cultivated a certain image of him. And he certainly had very, what we would call liberal or enlightened attitudes on a number of issues. But unfortunately, in his attitudes towards Jews and his attitudes towards Asians, we see, but from both his private remarks and in some cases his public statements, that liberalism did not extend to those minority groups.
Okay. All right. So let's see what else. Someone wants you to talk about the Dred Scott decision and maybe remind us what it is, and is asking, do you see any parallels with that decision from 1857?
So Dred Scott basically said that blacks were not citizens of the United States. They were property. A couple of things there. Citizenship is a run through as far as the treatment of people of color, immigrant communities, marginalized peoples in this country. And so going back to what Raphael was saying about who's the ideal, who's the citizen, right? Who's the perfect person? And the perfect person is going to be white, male, and not look like, not black, not Asian, not whatever. And so blacks in Dred Scott were held, they could not become citizens. Very famous cases involving Asian Americans. Chinese Americans could not be a citizen. Hindus could not become a citizen. And you see some rhetoric in these cases saying, we not kind of know what a citizen looks like. And this is not what a citizen looks like, right? We can tell just by looking at them, their skin's different. And so going back to what Raphael said, I think that you see this through line of people who can be citizens and who can't be citizens. And citizenship wasn't open to Asian Americans until 1952. So this is actually a very recent development. The other thing is just to draw back to what Raphael was saying about subhumanness, right? Is that you're an other. You're not like us. And so that's basically what Dred Scott was about, is that blacks, former slaves, are just not in the same category. Asian Americans have dealt with this whole category of being forever foreign, the China virus, things like that you've heard in the press. And so I think there's a lot of parallels. And Japanese Americans, I think it's really, allyship is so important, because when we have an instance happen against a group of people, it's all deriving from the same otherness and the same foreignness and the same hostility, as opposed to separate things.
Couldn't have
Now,
said it better.
go ahead. Is there something you want to add?
No, couldn't have said it better.
Okay. Now, the Korematsu case, the 1944 Supreme Court case, still stands as the law of the land, does it not, as a Supreme Court precedent?
I'll let Lori take that as well, but yes, it's still what they call good law, and take it away.
As I mentioned before, the Supreme Court's most recent statement is that Korematsu has been overruled by the court of history. There's no such thing really as a court of history. And so as far as my understanding of it, the Supreme Court has not overruled Korematsu. And in fact, reading it, it absolutely reaffirmed the notion that courts must step aside when the government claims that it's acting in national security, even in the face of anti-religious, racist comments. So the Supreme Court acknowledged what Trump said as far as Islam hates us and things like that. But it said those statements don't matter, because he's saying his actions are required by national security. So I would say maybe before people would be nervous about citing Korematsu. Now they don't need to be, because they can now cite Trump versus Hawaii. So I think it is totally affirmed as law now.
I see.
Lori is obviously right that there's literally no court of history. I suppose what that justice meant was referring to the idea that over the course of history, the force of public opinion can deeply influence what courts do, and public opinion shifts as society has gradually become more progressive and more enlightened. A decision like the Dred Scott decision could not be handed down today because the overwhelming majority of Americans would reject such thinking. In the case of the mass internment of the Japanese, there also was a significant shift in public opinion, so that finally in the 1980s, then President Ronald Reagan publicly acknowledged the terrible wrong that had been done in the mass internment of the Japanese, and the U.S. government, at his direction, paid restitution. Unfortunately, it was, in my opinion, far too modest, but made restitution payments to many of the survivors of the internment. So public opinion in this country shifted very significantly, obviously, by the 1980s. So that sense of the court of history, well, there are things today that are inconceivable and our courts would never justify, but yet other Supreme Court justices a century ago or more did consider legitimate.
Well, it's been 40 years since the 1980s, and public opinion is shifting again, unfortunately, I think in the wrong direction, which is what's so dismaying to me. I've heard people in the administration cite Korematsu and saying that FDR was right to do what he did. Public opinion in the courts shouldn't rule the courts necessarily. So,
well, we're getting to the end of the hour and it's flown by, but I'd like to give you a chance for some final remarks. So, Raphael, please go ahead.
Thank you. It's disturbing to learn about a president harboring racist sentiments. Now, it's certainly true that back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, racism, anti-Semitism, hostility towards Asians and other races was widespread. Later presidents, we eventually discovered, also sometimes harbored prejudices. We know from Richard Nixon's Oval Office tapes about some of the derogatory comments he made about Jews and others. We know from Harry Truman's private diary that he harbored rather strong anti-Semitic sentiments. But I think the crucial difference between what a Truman or Nixon thought privately and what Franklin Roosevelt thought privately was that in the case of Truman and Nixon, there's no evidence that it ever affected their policy. So we expect a higher standard, I think, from our elected leaders, and we would like for presidents not to harbor those kinds of prejudicial sentiments. But most importantly, we would not want any of those sentiments to be translated into policy. In the sad case of Franklin Roosevelt, what we see is that his hostility to Jews and his very similar hostility to Asian Americans probably played some part in influencing his extremely harsh policy toward Jewish refugees during the Holocaust and his otherwise inexplicable decision to authorize the mass detention of innocent Japanese Americans. So the problem, first and foremost, is when people harbor racist sentiments, but more to the point, the real problem is when our elected leaders, in some cases, not only harbor such sentiments, but actually carry out policies that were influenced, at least in part, by those awful sentiments.
Thank you, Raphael. Lori, what would you like to say today in closing to our audience?
I guess to follow up on one of the last topics, one of the reasons why a number of us involved in the Quorum Novus cases and involved in Japanese American redress struggle continue to speak about this today to organizations like your own and elsewhere is because I think a lot of people do get that the Japanese American incarceration was wrong. As Eric said, there are people out there who think it was the right thing to do, but generally speaking, a lot of people think it was wrong. And our country has recognized it's wrong, at least on paper and through the redress movement. That said, I think that if people, we continue to speak about it, because I think that if people can get why the Japanese American incarceration was wrong, the singling out of a particular group simply because of their race, the branding of them as illegals, the elderly and the young being put away in camp, if they can get that being wrong, maybe it's easier to push people to the next step and say it's also wrong when you suspend the rule of law in other circumstances. It's also wrong to attack the teaching of histories so we can learn about this. It's also wrong to suspend due process for people, immigrants who are being deported. It's also wrong to racialize public policy. And so that's something that I feel really strongly about. And so what I would encourage you to do is continue to participate in forums like this to learn, but also in wherever you are, let people know about the Japanese American incarceration, because I think it is a lesson that a lot of people can understand, can get, and unfortunately, a lot of people haven't heard about it, or they think they know about it and they really don't. So I would implore each of you to see ways in which you can help spread this story. Thank you.
Eric, as our filmmaker who's brought us this really important film, what would you like to say to our audience as your final words?
Well, I think I'll defer to Fred Korematsu, simply don't be afraid to speak up. One man can make a difference. Maybe you can make a difference. So don't be afraid to speak up.
You're here. Wow. What an important program. I've been wanting to show your film for several years. I'm glad we finally made it happen. So thanks to you. Thanks to Laurie and Raphael for giving us of your time, and to our audience. Please come again next week, Mother's Day. Have a wonderful week, everybody. Thank you so much. Be well.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.